There is an old saying among the grain families of the northern lake country, and it runs like this: "What the ledger cannot measure, the harvest will prove." It was not carved into any courthouse stone or printed in any extension bulletin. It passed from mouth to mouth, field to field, in the low and unremarkable voice of people who had learned things the hard way and saw no reason to announce the lesson. Vera Makinen heard it first from her grandmother, who heard it from hers, and who kept it written in pencil in the back pages of a water-stained notebook that smelled of cedar and turned earth. Vera had read that notebook so many times the pencil marks had softened into the paper like old weather. She knew every word. She did not talk about the notebook much. She did not talk about much at all. In the autumn of the year her husband died, Vera began doing something with her 70 acres that her neighbors could not account for. She tore out the alfalfa rotation she and Martin had kept for 11 years. She did not plant soybeans, which the co-op was recommending strongly that season, citing favorable futures prices and their own new drying facility over on County Road K. She did not plant corn. She ordered an obscure variety of heritage two-row barley from a small seed house in Manitoba, a variety so old its name appeared in the Manitoba catalog only as a regional designation and a lot number, and she planted it on 40 of her 70 acres in a thin, deliberate, widely spaced pattern that made her fields look sparse and sickly compared to every other stand on the road. The remaining 30 acres she seeded to a heritage winter rye, a long-strawed, slow-maturing variety that nobody had grown commercially in the surrounding 4 counties for at least 30 years, maybe more. People drove past and looked. They slowed their trucks. They formed opinions. What the ledger cannot measure, the harvest will prove. That was the refrain Vera's grandmother had set down at the top of the last page of the notebook, and Vera had accepted it the way you accept a fact of weather or a fact of bone structure, not as a comfort exactly, but as a thing you carry because it is true and because the truth of it will matter to you later. She was 53 years old that autumn. She had been farming beside Martin since she was 24. She was not grieving improperly. She was not confused. She had a plan, and the plan was grounded in 40 pages of her grandmother's close, considered handwriting, and in 2 years of Vera's own quiet research, and in a single conversation with a maltster named Desmond Kroll who operated a small craft malt house out of a converted granary 90 miles to the southeast, who had told her over the phone, in a steady and deliberate voice, that if she could grow him consistent, clean, properly managed heritage malt grain, he would buy every bushel she could bring him at a price that made the co-op's posted prices look like an apology. That conversation had happened 8 months before Martin died. She had told Martin about it the same evening. He had sat with it for 3 days and then said, "Do it." He was a quiet man, too. It was one of the reasons they had been well suited. She did not explain any of this to the people who slowed their trucks. The field work that autumn was hard and strange and particular. Vera seeded the barley at a rate and spacing the Manitoba catalog recommended for maximum head development rather than maximum yield, which was counterintuitive, which looked wrong, which the county extension agent, a broad-shouldered and permanently cheerful man named Gerald Paulson, described as leaving money in the ground when he stopped by in the second week of October. Gerald was not unkind. He had known Vera and Martin for 18 years. He stood at the edge of the field with his boots in the first frost and tilted his head and said that he understood she was working through a hard year and that the co-op had a grief counseling referral service he could connect her to, and that in the meantime, he wanted her to know that the soybean numbers were still strong and it was not too late to make some adjustments to her plan if she wanted to talk it through. Vera said, "I have a plan, Gerald." He said he knew she did, and his voice was gentle in a way that meant he did not believe the plan was a plan. He left a brochure about the co-op's soybean incentive program on her porch railing, weighted down with a smooth stone he found in her gravel drive, and drove away in his white pickup. She watched him go. Then she went back to the field. Her dog, a 7-year-old shepherd mix named Cal, had been watching from the top of the slope all morning. He watched the truck leave. Then he came down the slope and sat near her feet and watched her too. with the particular attention of a creature who had long since decided that wherever she went was the correct place to be. She reached down once and touched the top of his head without looking at him. That was all. The barley came up thin and even and pale in the first week, and then it strengthened through October in the cold, dry air, and by the time the ground froze hard in November, it was established in a way that only Vera and the notebook understood, because the notebook was explicit. The old varieties, her grandmother had written, do not announce themselves early. They root deep before they reach up. This is the nature of things that intend to last. Vera read that line again in December, sitting at the kitchen table with tea she had let go cold, Cal asleep under her chair. She read it 3 more times. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. Part 2. The spring came early and wet and then turned suddenly dry in a way that nobody predicted. The co-op's agronomist, a younger man named Blake Schreiber, who had come up from the university extension 2 years prior and who wore his confidence the way some men wear new boots, too stiff and too loud, came out to Vera's farm in April to introduce himself formally and to assess what he described in a memo to the co-op board as a concerning situation with a recently widowed producer who had made some unconventional seed choices under apparent emotional duress. He did not share the memo with Vera. He shared his smile, which was wide and practiced, and his handshake, which was firm. He told her he had reviewed her field records from prior years and that he was impressed by her and Martin's yields. He said he wanted to help her get back to that trajectory. He walked the field with her. He crouched at the barley rows and rubbed a leaf between his fingers and was silent for a moment and then said it looked like there had been some trouble with the seeding rate. Vera said, "No trouble." He looked at her steadily and said the plant population was considerably below any threshold that would generate a meaningful return, and that given the dryness that was setting in, a wide-spaced, low-population stand was going to struggle badly, and that she should think seriously about whether it made sense to disc this under and replant with something that could still salvage the season. She said, "It will not struggle." He wrote in his memo that the producer was resistant to consultation. What he did not know, because he had not read the notebook and would not have been inclined to trust it if he had, was that low population seeding in a dry year was precisely the point. The old 2-row barley her grandmother had catalogued and the winter rye on the South 30 were varieties selected over generations for exactly this condition: scarce moisture, deep root competition eliminated by wide spacing, long, slow development. Each plant would tiller aggressively, throw 8 to 12 heads where a modern crowded variety would throw 2 or 3, root down 2 feet into subsoil moisture that the dry spring could not touch. They were not underperforming. They were loading. Nobody could see it but Vera, and she had no interest in explaining it to Blake Schreiber, who had not asked a question, only delivered verdicts. He came back in May. He came back in June. Each time the fields looked to the conventional eye like a marginal stand that a distracted or despairing woman was allowing to drift toward failure. Each time he was courteous and concerned and offered solutions. Each time Vera thanked him and went back to work. Cal watched every visit from the high ground with his ears forward and his body very still, and when the visitors left he came down and resumed his post near Vera's feet. In June, a neighbor named Robert Ellenbeck, who ran 400 acres to the north and who was, by local consensus, the most financially successful farmer in the township, drove down to the fence line one evening and stood there until Vera walked over. He was not unkind either, in his way. He told her the barley looked thin. He told her the rye looked wrong. He told her, with the careful syntax of a man delivering bad news in the gentlest possible casing, that his brother-in-law worked at the co-op elevator and had heard she was having a difficult season, and that if she found herself short at harvest, he, Robert, would be willing to talk about leasing the south parcel for next year at a fair rate. Give her time to regroup. No pressure, just an option to have on the table. She looked at the south parcel. She looked at Robert. She said, "Those 30 acres are not available." He nodded. He said the offer would stand. He drove home. 3 weeks later, a woman named Inez Carvalho appeared at the end of Vera's lane on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a pickup with a hand-lettered sign in the back window that read, Maplewood Community Supported Agriculture. She was 41, dark-haired, deliberate in her movements, and she had driven past Vera's fields 6 times in the past month without stopping, which she now admitted freely, saying she had wanted to understand what she was looking at before she interrupted. What she had concluded, she said, was that she was looking at a managed system, not a troubled one. She had grown up in a farm family in the valley south of town. She knew the difference. Vera studied her for a moment. Then she said, "You want to come in?" It was not a question. Inez said yes. She came in. Cal assessed her in the doorway for 4 seconds and then stepped back and let her pass, which was his version of approval. Vera made coffee. Inez did not explain herself further until the coffee was poured, and then she said simply that she had been trying to source heritage small grains for a regional food network and had been told by 3 different people that there were no commercial growers within 100 miles, and that when she looked at Vera's fields, she thought those people might have been wrong. Vera set down her cup. She said, "They were wrong." Inez said, "What do you need?" Vera told her. What she needed was help with the harvest, because the old varieties would not run cleanly through a modern combine at the header height that maximized efficiency, and she had already arranged to borrow a machine that could be adjusted, but she needed 2 people who would work carefully and without complaint for 4 days in late July and 4 days in mid-August, and who would not require a great deal of managing. Inez said she was one of those people, and she could find the other. She was right. She found a young man named Peter, who arrived on the first harvest day with a thermos and a pair of leather gloves and asked exactly 3 questions, all of them practical, and then worked until dark without elaboration. The 4 of them, Vera and Inez and Peter and Cal circling the perimeter with his nose down, brought in the rye first and then the barley across 8 days total, and when the last load came off the field, and Vera stood in the evening light looking at the covered wagons by the granary, she felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph. It was more like the end of a long breath she had been holding since October. Part 3. The co-op's records for that year show 70 acres of Vera Mackinnon's land categorized in the seasonal assessment as low-yield/unclassifiable grain, potential loss scenario, producer non-responsive to agronomic consultation. The co-op had not bought her grain because she had not offered it to them. She had called Desmond Krall the week before harvest began and given him her projected tonnage numbers, and he had said, "I'll be there the first week of September." He was. He drove a truck with a small enclosed trailer for samples and came alone, and he spent 4 hours in Vera's granary with a moisture meter and a sample grinder and a loop and a notebook of his own, a new one, wire-bound, which he wrote in steadily and without looking up for long stretches. Then he sat at Vera's kitchen table and told her what he had found. The Heritage 2-row barley was the finest raw malt grain he had handled in 7 years of operation. The protein levels were ideal. The kernel uniformity was exceptional. The low population seeding she had used had produced exactly the head development the old variety was capable of, which the crowded modern seeding method had been systematically suppressing for decades. The winter rye was equally extraordinary, a grain that the craft distilling market was currently paying a premium for that most people outside the industry did not know existed, because most people outside the industry were not looking for it. He told her the price he would pay per bushel, for both grains, under a 2-year contract. Vera read the number on the paper he slid to her. She read it again. She said, "That is correct?" He said, "That is correct." And then he said, in the same level tone, that he wished he had found her 2 years ago, because he had been unable to locate a consistent domestic source for either variety and had been importing from a German supplier at a logistics cost that was narrowing his margin considerably. She signed the contract. He loaded the samples. He drove 90 miles back to his granary and began processing the first delivery that came the following week. The total payment from the first year's contract was more than 3 times what the co-op's soybeans would have returned on the same acreage in the same dry year. Vera did the numbers twice at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of graph paper. She did not call anyone. She set the paper on the table and sat with it, and Cal put his chin on her knee, and she kept her hand on his head for a long time. What the ledger cannot measure, the harvest will prove. She thought about the notebook. She thought about her grandmother, who had grown these same varieties on land 2 counties north, before consolidation and changing markets had made it economically irrational, and the knowledge had retreated from common practice into penciled pages in a cedar chest. The knowledge had not gone anywhere. It had waited. That was the nature of things that intend to last. Part 4. The summer 2 years after Vera's first malt grain harvest was the kind of summer that the lake country had not seen in living memory, or so the people who had not been paying attention said. Vera had been paying attention. The notebook's back pages included her grandmother's observations about weather patterns across 4 decades, recorded without drama. The dry years cluster. They tend to run 3 together. When the first one is early and the frost follows late, watch for the sequence. The first dry year had been Vera's first planting year. The second had been easier on everyone, a partial recovery, enough rain in June to make the corn look good and the soybean futures look reasonable. The third year began in May with the soil moisture reading that Vera noted in her own notebook, a newer one she had started keeping in the same format as her grandmother's, and the reading told her what was coming. She spent March and April preparing. She deepened one of her water catchment arrangements on the north slope. She adjusted her seeding density even lower, which seemed impossible to the people who had watched the prior 2 years and still could not see what she was building. She said nothing. She worked. Cal was 9 years old now and moved more slowly between his monitoring posts, but he held his position. By the end of June, the county was in severe drought. By the end of July, it was in exceptional drought, which is the category above severe, the one that means the instruments have run out of ordinary language. The corn on Robert Ellenbeck's 400 acres had tasseled early under heat stress and was now curling at the margins in a way that agronomists call firing. The leaves going brown from the edges inward, like paper in a low flame. The co-op's posted cash price for corn was rising because the regional crop was failing, but rising cash prices do not help a farmer whose corn is already fired, already committed, already a loss in the field. Blake Schreiber drove past Vera's fields in the first week of August. He did not stop. He slowed to nearly a halt in front of the barley and sat there for what his own account later suggested was several minutes. The barley was head-high, clean, full, green in a county that was going tan. The rye on the South 30 was already past full maturity, standing straight on its long straw, waiting for harvest. The wide spacing had allowed each plant to root to a depth where the topsoil drought could not follow. The catchment work on the north slope had preserved what little rain had fallen in May and fed it down through the field margin into the root zone steadily through June and July. The system was doing what the system was built to do. He drove on. Robert Ellenbeck came to Vera's fence line on a Thursday in the second week of August. He did not have the look of a man delivering carefully packaged news this time. He had the look of a man carrying something he had not expected to be carrying. He said his corn was gone. He said he was looking at a loss on the whole north section that he was not sure the operating line could absorb, and that he had not wanted to ask for anything, but he was asking now. He said he had 40 acres on the east side of the road that had been fallow for 2 years, and that were going to sit empty again next year at this rate, and he wanted to know, if she was willing, if she might be interested in an arrangement. Vera looked at him. She said, "What kind of arrangement?" He said he did not entirely know. He said he thought she might know better than he did. She was quiet for a long time. Robert Ellenbeck had 400 acres and a grain bin complex that cost more than her whole farm. He had stood at this same fence line 2 years ago and offered to lease her land at a fair rate so she could regroup, which had been the most quietly devastating sentence anyone had spoken to her in a hard year, not because he had meant it badly, but because he had meant it well and had not been able to see what she was actually doing. She did not say any of that. She said, "I will come over next week and look at the East Acres. If they will work, we will work something out at cost." He said, "At cost." She said, "You are not the first person this year who needed something." You will not be the last. I am not in the business of profiting from a drought." She turned and went back to her work. He stood at the fence for a while. Then he left. Part 5. The harvest that third year was the largest Vera had run. Desmond Kroll extended the contract without renegotiation, absorbing the increased volume without complaint because, as he wrote to her in a letter she kept in the notebook's inside cover, the malt house had now built its entire production identity around her grain, and the reputation was traveling faster than the supply. He had been contacted by 4 craft distillers in 3 states who wanted her rye specifically. He asked if she was considering expansion. She was considering expansion. She was considering it carefully, the way she considered everything, which meant she was also considering what expansion would cost in terms of the particular quality that made the system work, which was her attention to it. She wrote back and said she would think about it over the winter. She spent 2 weeks in November with Inez, who had by now become something close to a full partner in the field operation and who had a head for logistics that complemented Vera's practical knowledge in a way that made both of them more capable than either had been alone. Peter had stayed on seasonally and brought 2 more people the second year, both young, both from farm families, both interested in the old varieties in a way that reminded Vera of herself at 20, looking at her grandmother's notebook and thinking, "There is something here that everyone has forgotten and no one has told me yet." That was what she had built, she understood, sitting at the kitchen table in November with Inez across from her, and a map of the county spread between them and Cal asleep under the table, his breathing slow and even as the frost built on the kitchen windows. She had not just built a crop system. She had built a seed library in practice, which is the only kind of seed library that actually preserves anything, because seeds kept in jars in the dark lose their character over time. But seeds grown year after year in conditions that test them keep getting stronger and more particular to the place. Her barley now was not exactly the barley in the Manitoba catalog. It was that barley plus 3 years of her specific soil and her specific weather and her specific management, and the result was something that Desmond Kroll had told her, with the quiet enthusiasm of a craftsman recognizing excellence in raw material, was becoming genuinely irreplaceable. She looked at the county map. She looked at Robert Ellenbeck's East Acres, which she had walked in October and found suitable. She looked at 2 other parcels she had identified. She said to Inez, "We can take on 40 more acres next year if we do it the way I want to do it." Inez said, "Show me." Vera showed her. The way she wanted to do it meant no shortcuts in the seeding, no variance in the management, no deviation from the spacing and timing and the catchment work, regardless of what any particular season's economics suggested was the efficient choice. It meant teaching every person who worked the land exactly what they were doing and why, so that the knowledge was not dependent on any single person's continued health or presence. She had learned that lesson in October 2 years ago. She had no intention of learning it twice. Inez listened and then said, "That is not a farm operation. That is a school." Vera said, "Yes." Part 6. Blake Schreiber came to see her in February of the following year, the 4th year. He came without advance notice, which she took as an indication that he was not there in any official capacity. He knocked, and she let him in. And Cal regarded him from under the table with the careful neutrality of an animal who had seen this man before and not forgotten. Schreiber sat down. He did not have his notebook. He had his hands flat on the table and an expression she had not seen on him before, a kind of careful, expensive stillness, like a man who has revised his notes extensively and is choosing his first sentence with care. He said, "I think I owe you an honest conversation." She said, "All right." He said he had been reviewing his consultation records from the first 2 years in preparation for an extension service assessment, and that reviewing them had been uncomfortable reading. He said he had written the phrase resistant to consultation 5 times in 2 years, and that it had taken him too long to consider the possibility that the consultation was the problem rather than the resistance. She did not say anything. He said, "The drought performance on your acres. People are asking questions about it. I have been asked to write something up for the Extension Bulletin about low population heritage variety seeding as a drought-resilient strategy. I wanted to ask you first if you would be willing to share your methods. And I wanted to ask you in person rather than through a records request because, he paused, because I have not been fair to you and I wanted to say that directly. She looked at him for a while. Outside, the February light was low and white and even, and it came through the kitchen window and lay flat on the table between them. She said, I will share the methods. The notebook that guides them is not mine to share, but I can write out the core principles in plain language. You are welcome to use them in the bulletin. He said, the notebook. She said, my grandmother's. She kept records for 40 years on varieties that everyone else stopped growing. The notebook is why I knew what to plant and how. He was quiet. Then he said, how many people know this notebook exists? She said, now? Several. I have been making sure of that. Part 7. Cal died in the spring of the 5th year, on a morning in late April when the ground was just soft enough to work. He had been slower all winter and had taken to sleeping in the warmest corner of the kitchen rather than patrolling the yard, but he had made it to April, and on that particular morning, Vera had carried him out to the field in her arms and set him down in the new barley rows, which were barely showing above the soil, thin and pale and certain. And he had put his nose to the earth and breathed for a long time, and then he had lain down on his side in the spring sun, and she had sat beside him with her hand on his flank until the breathing stopped. She buried him at the top of the north slope, where he had spent 7 years watching over the operation, and she did not mark the grave with anything except a flat field stone she brought up from the creek, and she sat there for a long time before she went back to work. Inez found her at the end of the day coming in from the South 30 and understood without asking, and said nothing, and simply walked beside her back to the house. The 5th harvest was the largest yet. Robert Ellenbeck's East 40 produced beautifully. 2 of the young people Peter had brought on, a woman named Saoirse and a man named Marcus, had become capable enough to manage their own sections without daily direction, and Vera had begun meeting with them each week in the kitchen the way a person teaches who knows that the knowledge has to outlast the teacher. She showed them the notebook. She showed them both notebooks, her grandmother's and her own, which was now 64 pages of close and careful writing, the same pencil, the same format, the same conviction that the record existed not for the person writing it, but for the person who would need it later, in a year or a season or a generation, when the knowledge would otherwise be gone. Desmond Krall drove out in September of the 5th year, which he had not done before, having always received the grain at his end. He came without particular announcement, just a phone call the day before saying he would like to see the farm if she did not mind. He walked the fields with her for 2 hours, largely in silence, asking occasional precise questions that showed he understood what he was seeing. At the end of the walk, he stood at the top of the north slope and looked out over the 70 acres and the additional East 40 and the flat country beyond, and he said, "This is the cleanest operation I have ever had the privilege of sourcing from." She said, "It is the notebook." He said, "It is more than the notebook." She considered that. Then she said, "The notebook makes it legible. The work makes it real." He nodded. He said the malt house had been approached by a regional brewing cooperative about a heritage grain partnership, a 3-year supply agreement, which would require him to double his incoming volume. He wanted to know whether she was interested in helping him find 2 more growers in the county who could be trained to her system. She said, "I already know who they are." She brought Saoirse and Marcus into the conversation the following week. She introduced Robert Ellenbeck and 2 other neighbors whose land she had assessed. She sat at the table with all of them and laid out the notebook, both notebooks open, and said, "This is what you are looking at. This is the grain. This is the management. This is the record. You do not deviate from the record without understanding exactly why the record says what it says. If you do not understand, you ask. That is the rule." Nobody asked what the price would be. She told them anyway. Several of them were quiet for a while after she told them. Marcus said, and the co-op did not know this existed. Vera said, the co-op knew. They chose what to measure. She did not say it with anger. She said it as a plain statement, a fact of the situation, the way you say the frost comes in October or the rye takes 130 days. The co-op had its instruments, and its instruments were calibrated to what had always been profitable and what was legible to spreadsheets and seasonal projections. And neither the old barley nor the old rye had been legible to those instruments, and so the instruments had reported nothing, and the co-op had written off 70 acres as a loss scenario and sent a man with a wide smile and new boots to suggest she disc it under. What the ledger cannot measure, the harvest will prove. She closed the notebooks. She looked around the table at 7 people who had come to learn what she had spent 5 years rebuilding from 40 pages of her grandmother's pencil writing. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was doing what October light does in the lake country, going low and amber and enormous across the flat land, making the empty fields after harvest look not bare but rested, like something gathering itself for what it intended to do next. There is a sign mounted now on the north end wall of Desmond Crawl's malt house, and it has been there for 6 years, and it is a plain piece of white oak with the words routed into it in a plain face, no ornament. It reads as follows. It does not say who put it there or whose words they are, which was the condition Vera gave when Desmond asked if she would allow it. She said if it says anyone's name, it says the wrong thing. The sign says only this. What the ledger cannot measure, the harvest will prove. Beneath it on a small shelf sits a wire-bound notebook, the second one, its cover worn, its pages full, and beside it, a flat fieldstone from a creek in the lake country. And anyone who asks is told what the stone is for, and the telling takes a while, and it is worth the time.